Chapter 3. Even so, I was ill prepared for the visit of Mr. Allan and his brothers on the following Monday night. They came at 10:15. My mother had just gone upstairs to bed. I had expected, at most, 3 of them. There were 7, and they were as alike as peas in a pod, so much so that I could not pick from among them the Mr. Allan with whom I had twice walked the nocturnal streets of Providence, though I assumed it was he who was the spokesman for the group. They filed into the living room, and Mr. Allan immediately set about arranging chairs in a semicircle, with the help of his brothers, murmuring something about the nature of the experiment, though, to tell the truth, I was still much too amazed and disquieted at the appearance of 7 identical men, all of whom bore so strong a resemblance to Edgar Allan Poe as to startle the beholder to assimilate what was being said. Moreover, I saw now by the light of my Welsbach gas lamp that all 7 of them were of a pallid, waxen complexion, not of such a nature as to give me any doubt of their being flesh and bone like myself, but rather such as to suggest that one and all were afflicted with some kind of disease, anemia perhaps, or some kindred illness which would leave their faces colorless, and their eyes, which were very dark, seemed to stare fixedly, and yet without seeing, though they suffered no lack of perception, and seemed to perceive by means of some extra sense, not visible to me. The sensation that rose in me was not predominantly one of fear, but one of overwhelming curiosity tinged with a spreading sense of something utterly alien, not only to my experience, but to my existence. Thus far, little had passed between us, but now that the semicircle had been completed, and my visitors had seated themselves, their spokesman beckoned me forward and indicated a chair placed within the arc of the semicircle, facing the seated men. "Will you sit here, Mr. Phillips?" he asked. I did as he asked, and found myself the object of all eyes, but not essentially so much their object as their focal point, for the 7 men seemed to be looking not so much at me as through me. "Our intention, Mr. Phillips," explained their spokesman, whom I took to be the gentleman I had encountered on Benefit Street, "is to produce for you certain impressions of extraterrestrial life. All that is necessary for you to do is to relax and to be receptive." "I am ready," I said. I had expected that they would ask for the light to be lowered, which seems to be integral to all such seance-like sessions, but they did not do so. They waited upon silence, save for the ticking of the hall clock and the distant hum of the city, and then they began what I can only describe as singing, a low, not unpleasant, almost lulling humming, increasing in volume, and broken with sounds I assumed were words, though I could not make out any of them. The song they sang and the way they sang it was indescribably foreign. The key was minor, and the tonal intervals did not resemble any terrestrial musical system with which I was familiar, though it seemed to me more oriental than occidental. I had little time to consider the music, however, for I was rapidly overcome with a feeling of profound malaise. The faces of the 7 men grew dim and coalesced to merge into one swimming face, and an intolerable consciousness of unrolled aeons of time swept over me. I concluded that some form of hypnosis was responsible for my condition, but I did not have any qualms about it. It did not matter, for the experience I was undergoing was utterly novel and not unpleasant, though there was inherent in it a discordant note, as of some lurking evil looming far behind the relaxing sensations that crowded upon me and swept me before them. Gradually, the lamp, the walls, and the men before me faded and vanished, and, though I was still aware of being in my quarters on Angel Street, I was also cognizant that somehow I had been transported to new surroundings, and an element of alarm at the strangeness of these surroundings, together with one of repulsion and alienation, began to make themselves manifest. It was as if I feared losing consciousness in an alien place without the means of returning to Earth. For it was an extraterrestrial scene that I witnessed, one of great and magnificent grandeur in its proportions, and yet one completely incomprehensible to me. Vast vistas of space whirled before me in an alien dimension, and central in them was an aggregation of gigantic cubes, scattered along a gulf of violet and agitated radiation, and other figures moving among them, enormous, iridescent, rugose cones, rising from a base almost 10 feet wide to a height of over 10 feet, and composed of ridgy, scaly, semi-elastic matter, and sporting from their apexes 4 flexible cylindrical members, each at least a foot thick, and of a similar substance, though more flesh-like, as that of the cones, which were presumably bodies for the crowding members, which, as I watched, had an ability to contract or expand, sometimes to lengthen to a distance equal to the height of the cone to which they adhered. 2 of these members were terminated with enormous claws, while a third wore a crest of 4 red trumpet-like appendages, and the 4th ended in a great yellow globe 2 feet in diameter, in the center of which were 3 enormous eyes, darkly opalescent, which, because of their position in the elastic member, could be turned in any direction whatsoever. It was such a scene as exercised the greatest fascination upon me, and yet at the same time spread in me a repellence inspired by its total alienation and the aura of fearful disclosures which alone could give it meaning and a lurking terror. Moreover, as I saw the moving figures, which seemed to be tending the great cubes, with greater clarity and more distinctness, I saw that their strange heads were crowned by 4 slender gray stalks carrying flower-like appendages, as well as, from their nether side, 8 sinuous elastic tentacles, moss-green in color, which seemed to be constantly agitated by serpentine motion, expanding and contracting, lengthening and shortening and whipping around, as if with life independent of that which animated, more sluggishly, the cones themselves. The whole scene was bathed in a wan, red glow, as from some dying sun which, failing its planet, now took second place to the violent radiation from the gulf. The scene had an indescribable effect on me. It was as if I had been permitted to look into another world, one incredibly vaster than our own, distinguished from our own by antipodally different values of life forms, and remote from ours in time and space, and as I gazed at this far world I became aware, as were this intelligence being funneled into me by some psychic means, that I looked upon a dying race, which must escape its planet or perish. Spontaneously, then, I seemed to recognize the burgeoning of a menacing evil, and with an urgent, violent effort, I threw off the bondage of the chant that held me in its spell, gave vent to the uprushing of fear I felt in a cry of protest, and rose to my feet, while the chair on which I sat fell backwards with a crash. Instantly the scene before my mind's eye vanished, and the room returned to focus. Across from me sat my visitors, the 7 gentlemen in the likeness of Poe, impassive and silent, for the sounds they had made, the humming and the odd, word-like tonal noises, had ceased. I calmed down. My pulse began to slow. "What you saw, Mr. Phillips, was a scene on another star, remote from here," said Mr. Allan. "Far out in space, indeed, in another universe. Did it convince you?" "I've seen enough," I cried. I could not tell whether my visitors were amused or scornful. They remained without expression, including their spokesman, who only inclined his head slightly and said, "We will take our leave then, with your permission." And silently, one by one, they all filed out into Angel Street. I was most disagreeably shaken. I had no proof of having seen anything on another world, but I could testify that I had experienced an extraordinary hallucination, undoubtedly through hypnotic influence. But what had been its reason for being? I pondered that as I set about to put the living room to rights, but I could not adduce any profound reason for the demonstration I had witnessed. I was unable to deny that my visitors had shown themselves to be possessed of extraordinary faculties, but to what end? And I had to admit to myself that I was as much shaken by the appearance of no less than 7 identical men as I was by the hallucinatory experience I had just passed through. Quintuplets were possible, yes, but had anyone ever heard of septuplets? Nor were multiple births of identical children usual. Yet here were 7 men, all of very much the same age, identical in appearance, for whose existence there was not a scintilla of explanation. Nor was there any graspable meaning in the scene that I had witnessed during the demonstration. Somehow I had understood that the great cubes were sentient beings, for whom the violet radiation was life-giving. I had realized that the cone creatures served them in some fashion or other, but nothing had been disclosed to show how. The whole vision was meaningless. It was just such a scene as might have been created by a highly organized imagination, and telepathically conveyed to a willing subject such as myself. That it proved the existence of extraterrestrial life was ridiculous. It proved no more than I had been the victim of an induced hallucination. But, once more, I came full circle. As hallucination, it was completely without reason for being. Yet I could not escape an insistent disquiet that troubled me long that night before I was able to sleep.